the decade of 1850. What happened during the decade of 1850? Well, one thing, this was the decade of the California gold rush. Now, I mentioned previously that gold had been discovered in California in 1848 at the end of the previous decade. And so now in the 1850s, this was a decade when all the men were rushing to California in hopes of finding gold and getting rich and then returning home to their families. And so they came to California, especially to the city of San Francisco. That became kind of a boom town where all the men came hoping to find gold. And they came primarily from two areas. Some men came from China and other men came from the east coast of the United States. Actually, this picture here, actually an early daguerreotype, an early photograph taken here that shows both men from, I believe the white men are probably from the East Coast, and Chinese men both together in this picture. Looks like they're looking for gold in California there. And I think I mentioned previously that it's interesting to note that it was actually easier to get to California from China than it was to get to California from the East Coast. Because if you came from the East Coast, you had to cross the entire continent on a wagon train if you wanted to go directly. And that was really difficult to go over land with a wagon train. That was very difficult. Or you could take a ship, go down to Panama and cross the continent at Panama, where it was the narrowest, and then take a ship up to California. Or you could take a ship all the way around the southern tip of South America. But all those were very difficult journeys to make, and it was actually easier to simply cross the ocean from China than it was to get to California from the East Coast. Nevertheless, a lot of men did come from the East Coast, and there are a lot of stories of men from the East Coast who left their families. They invested everything they could. They thought they'd go to California, they were going to get rich. And so they invested everything they had in paying so that they could make this trip to California. And so they left their families, they went to California, and unfortunately, they found no gold. And they had spent all their money. They didn't find any gold. So now they're stranded in California because they can't pay the money to return home because they spent everything to get there. Their plan was they were going to get rich when they got there and then come home rich, but now they're broke and can't return home. And meanwhile, their families, that usually these are the husbands that have left, and the families are now, the wives and children are left behind. They're struggling the best they can, anxiously awaiting, hoping that their husbands will return. And the Chinese workers also came and didn't find gold. Eventually, a lot of the Chinese men became involved in building the Transcontinental Railroad. After not finding gold, they went on to work for railroad companies because that will be a new expanding industry in the United States. Also, in the decade of 1850, in the United States, in academics, racist theories about polygenesis continue to be popular. Here I have a picture on the right-hand side of Josiah Nott. We talked about Josiah Nott before. He was one of the followers of Samuel Morton and part of this American school of ethnography, an academic tradition that focused on the idea of polygenesis, the idea that black people and white people are two different species. And in 1853, along with his co-author George Glidden, they published a book called Types of Mankind. And on the left-hand side of this page, you see a figure from this book in which they compared Greek and African and ape skulls. And I believe he was trying to make a point that he thought that the African skulls and the ape skulls were more similar and they were different from the Greek skulls. So again, in academics, very racist viewpoints supporting polygenesis, and this was the popular academic view in the United States around this time in history. The decade of 1850 is also a time of increasing tension over slavery in the United States. So politicians and plantation owners of the South wanted to expand slavery. They wanted to expand it into new territories and to have new slave states because it would be highly profitable for them if they could take their slaves to new areas to make money. And they argued that they had the right to take their property, that is, their slaves, to any place they wanted without restrictions. In other words, they were making a case for property rights, the right to take their slaves, their property, wherever they wanted. Now, in the North, people viewed this as the plantation owners trying to gain an unfair advantage. So people in the North were largely opposed to this. But the plantation owners and the Southern politicians had enough power that in 1850, the United States passed the Slave Fugitive Law. And the Slave Fugitive Law was a federal law stating that all runaway slaves must be returned to their masters, even if the slave had run away to a free state, and that people living in northern states could be prosecuted for giving assistance to a runaway slave. So this was a law supporting the property rights of the southern plantation owners to keep their slaves as property. And on the left-hand side of the screen, you see a poster from people from the North that were opposed to this law, warning black people about the risk that they could be kidnapped and taken to the South to become slaves. This is also the decade of the Dred Scott decision. And on the right-hand side of the screen is a picture of Dred Scott. So Dred Scott was born a slave. He traveled with his master to a free state and lived there. Then his master returned to a slave state, and Dred Scott also returned. Then Dred Scott's master died, and Dred Scott wanted to buy his freedom, but his master's widow, who inherited Dred Scott as a slave, she did not allow him to buy his freedom. So he wanted to buy his freedom. Dred Scott, his master's widow, who now inherited him, she said, no, you can't buy your freedom. And so when he wasn't allowed to buy his freedom, Dred Scott then claimed, well, we were in this free state for a while, therefore I'm a citizen of a free state, therefore I should be allowed to be set free. And this case went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court included several justices who were appointed by Andrew Jackson, who, if you recall, was very pro-slavery. So there were several pro-slavery justices on the Supreme Court. So you can guess how this decision went. The Supreme Court ruled against Dred Scott. Specifically, they ruled that black people cannot sue because they are not citizens of the United States. So the Dred Scott decision was that because Dred Scott was black, he cannot sue, black people cannot sue because they are not citizens of the United States. Now, as tensions over slavery were increasing in the United States, there was also a growing abolitionist movement in the North that was opposing slavery. And several things happened that increased the extent to which white people were becoming concerned about the evils of slavery. One of those events was that Harriet Beecher Stowe, an abolitionist in the North, wrote a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin. And the book was very effective, increasing people's sympathy for slaves. So Harriet Beecher Stowe, she was actually the daughter of Lyman Beecher. And if you recall, when we talked about the Second Great Awakening, that time of religious revival in the United States, there were some preachers in the North that were very famous and that had a large following. And Lyman Beecher is one of those preachers that had a large following during the Second Great Awakening. And so his daughter, Harriet Beecher, who became Harriet Beecher Stowe, is the one who wrote the book, Uncle Tom's Cabin. The story is, at one point in her life, she made a trip to the South and witnessed a slave auction and saw children being separated from their mothers at the slave auction, and was horrified by that event. And that was something that really moved her to become involved in the abolitionist movement. So she wrote this book, this fictional story called Uncle Tom's Cabin, that was from an abolitionist point of view, and illustrated the evils of slavery, and was very effective in increasing sympathy for slaves among white people. Now, as we've seen all along, oftentimes this abolitionist movement also takes the point of view of the assimilationist racist perspective, where black people and white people are not viewed as currently being equal. And Harriet Beecher Stowe certainly fits that type of racism. So although she was abolitionist, she still maintained a lot of racist stereotypes. So for example, she wrote that she said that black people are an exotic race, They are so essentially unlike the hard and dominant Anglo-Saxon race. Lowly docility of heart, their aptitude to repose on a superior mind and rest on a higher power, their childlike simplicity of affection and facility for forgiveness. In all these, they will exhibit the highest form of a peculiarly Christian life. In other words, she saw a difference between black people and white people and saw white people as being dominant and powerful and black people as being weak and submissive, which in that sense made black people better Christians than white people. And so she actually thought that white people were actually not as good Christians, but she thought that white people were more domineering and aggressive, and that white people could become better Christians by ending slavery and not taking advantage of black people. So she thought black people were submissive, white people were dominant, and white people could become better Christians if they ended slavery and were kind towards black people. Note that she also supported colonization. That was the idea that we should end slavery and that the freed slaves should then be deported and moved to Africa, and we should have a colony in Africa where the slaves, the black people, would live. So she was an abolitionist. She was very important in increasing sympathy for the abolitionist movement, and she was instrumental in making the abolitionist movement popular in the North at this point in history. But as we've seen as well, this abolitionist movement tended to maintain the racist assimilationist point of view. Another important person in the abolitionist movement is Frederick Douglass, pictured here. And Frederick Douglass wrote an autobiographical book called My Bondage and My Freedom that was published in 1855. And in this book, he describes his experience as a slave, and then eventually he escaped from slavery. And this book was effective in portraying his experience as a slave in a way that increased sympathy for slaves among white people in the North. And so this book played an important role in adding to the momentum of the abolitionist movement and making white people concerned about slaves and making white people aware of the evils of slavery. Notably, Douglass was a friend of William Lloyd Garrison. Recall that Garrison, at this point in history, was probably the most famous white abolitionist. Garrison was a person that published that abolitionist newspaper called The Liberator. Garrison was a person that was a leader in the American Anti-Slavery Society. And actually, Garrison and Douglass spent a lot of time together. And Garrison arranged for Douglass to kind of go on a speaking tour where Douglass would go to American Anti-Slavery Society meetings and tell his story about what it's like being a slave. And again, he told his story in a way that made it easy for white people to be sympathetic and easy for white people to see the evils of slavery. Actually, Lloyd Garrison and Douglass were friends for quite a while, but at some point in their life, they had some kind of a personal conflict and a falling out, and later on, they became angry with each other. But for quite a while, they worked together. Notably, after Douglass published his book, at that point, it was no longer safe for him to live in the United States, and so at that point, he went to live in Europe for a few years after that. Another notable figure in the abolitionist movement is John Brown, who is pictured here on the right, an actual picture, and on the left, a painting from much later. So John Brown was a white man, and he was an abolitionist, and he might have been unlike other abolitionists of the time, and that I'm not aware of him voicing viewpoints that black slaves were inferior to white people or inferior to other black people. I'm not sure, but I'm not aware of him voicing that type of viewpoint. He was also unlike other current abolitionists in another important way. So at this point in time, most abolitionists believed and hoped that slavery could be ended peacefully. That slavery could be ended by using persuasion without violence. In contrast, Brown believed that slavery, which was a much bigger problem than this, and he thought it would take an armed resistance to stop slavery. Slavery could only be stopped by using violence. Today, we can look back and realize that, well, John Brown was actually right. It did take a war to end slavery. But at this point in history, John Brown's viewpoint was viewed as a very extreme and dangerous viewpoint. So, in 1859, John Brown got together the biggest group he could assemble, which was a group of only about 20 men. And in that group, they raided a federal armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. That is a place that had a lot of weapons and guns, and they raided that armory. And their plan was to raid the armory, get the weapons, then distribute the weapons to slaves in the area with the idea that would start an uprising, and the uprising would grow and grow and snowball and would eventually lead to the end of slavery. That was their hope. As it turned out, they actually did successfully raid the armory and get the weapons, but from that point, everything failed and fumbled. It didn't go very well. They failed to start an uprising. Instead, they were all captured, and John Brown was hanged. And that was the end of his raid on Harper's Ferry. But that shows you there was growing tensions over slavery, and as part of the growing abolitionist movement is the story of John Brown and his raid on the federal armory at Harper's Ferry. Another part of the abolitionist movement was the development of a new political party called the Republicans. Now, this political party is different from the previous political party that was also called the Republicans. So, for example, Thomas Jefferson would be called a Republican, but that was a different political party. That party actually died out several decades ago. When Andrew Jackson became president, Andrew Jackson was a Democrat, and that was the start of the Democratic Party. And then the people that opposed the Democrats were called Whigs. So for several years, the United States had two primary political parties, and those two parties were the Democrats and the Whigs. Now, eventually some of these Whigs would join the newly forming Republican political party. And the Republican Party was largely an anti-slavery party, although they were not anti-slavery because they cared about the evils of slavery so much, and they certainly didn't think that black people and white people were equal to each other, but rather they were an anti-slavery party largely for selfish reasons, because they believed that the expansion of slavery would limit opportunities for white people. That is, if slavery expanded in the West, and if we had more slave states and more slave territories, they thought what would happen is that all these wealthy white plantation owners from the South, they would get all the land, and that would make it hard for other white people to obtain land and make a living. So their argument was that an economic system based on free labor would work better than a system based on slave labor, because a free labor system will be a system that will create more opportunities for white people, and when you have the presence of slaves, that limits opportunities for white people. So they were opposed to slavery, and the reason for opposing slavery was largely because of this free labor argument they made, which was more an argument based on selfish reasons, wanting to have opportunities for white people rather than them being compassionate for black people or concerned about the evils of slavery necessarily. One group that's associated with the Republicans, the abolitionist movement, and the free labor movement was the movement of wide awakes. This is something that maybe is not so widely known about the time, but the wide awakes were a part of the abolitionist movement. And the wide awakes, so that they were a northern anti-slavery groups of men, and these men, they wore military hats and shiny black capes, and they carried torches. And the picture on this slide here shows a man who's part of this wide awake movement, dressed in his uniform. And they held silent torchlight parades during the night in protest of slavery and in support of the abolitionist movement and in support of the Republican Party. So the Wide Awakes, they were men, they dressed in these uniforms, and they held silent torchlight parades at nighttime against slavery and in support of the Republican movement and in support of the free labor argument as well. And a rising star within the new Republican political party was Abraham Lincoln. Here I have a couple pictures of Lincoln. On the left is an actual picture of Lincoln from around this time. And on the right is a picture from Lincoln's campaign when he was running for president, in which he is depicted as Lincoln the rail splitter. That is, he's splitting logs to make a rail fence. And so he was depicted as a hard-working man with experience splitting logs to make fences so that he would be appealing to the average hard-working man or the average hard-working white man in the United States. And so Lincoln was part of the Republican Party, and as such, he would have been against slavery. But he was not opposed to slavery because he thought black people and white people were equal, but he was opposed on the basis of that free labor argument. That is, he thought the expansion of slavery would limit opportunities for white people. Let me give you a few quotes from Lincoln from campaign speeches he made around this time to give you a feel what his views were on race. So here's one quote. In one speech, Lincoln said, "I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of white and black races. I never advocated making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people. I will say, in addition to this, that there is a physical difference between the white and black races, which I believe will forever forbid the two races living together on terms of social and political equality." So he clearly did not see white people and black people as equal. Or here's another quote. This one of the criticisms that Lincoln often received from pro-slavery people was a criticism that if you eliminate slavery, that's going to encourage white people and black people to marry and to have babies, and there'll be racial mixing, and that would be a terrible thing from that viewpoint. And so in response to that argument, Lincoln said this. He says, "I say upon this occasion, I do not perceive that because the white man is to have the superior position, the Negro should be denied everything. I do not understand the position of my opponents who argue that because I do not want a Negro woman for a slave, I must necessarily want her for a wife." And I have a note here that at that point, there were cheers and laughter within the audience. And then Lincoln goes on to say, "My understanding is that I can just let her alone. I am now in my 50th year, and I certainly never have had a black woman for either a slave or a wife. So it seems to me quite possible for us to get along without making either slaves or wives of our Negroes." So again, Lincoln was definitely against slavery, but his primary argument was that free labor argument. He thought the expansion of slavery would limit opportunities for white people, and that is the reason why he opposed slavery. He certainly held racist types of viewpoints that he talked about when he gave his speeches.
That says, when the shadows fall and light shines on a call for compassion and sorrow. Tomorrow, 'cause when the shadows fall and light shines out a call for compassion and sorrow, maybe we can be the people with hope for tomorrow.
Although women at this time in history were prevented from doing very much, one woman who became a strong advocate for people with mental illness is Dorothea Dix. So Dorothea Dix grew up essentially during that Second Great Awakening, that time of religious revival in the United States. Her father was a Methodist evangelical preacher, one of those circuit riders who went from church to church. Although Dix appears to have had a traumatic or very sad childhood, we don't know very much about it because she rarely talked about it. And she seems to have disowned her parents. And she actually left her parents' house when she was 12 or 14. I've seen different ages in different reports. And she left her parents' house and went to live with her grandmother. And her grandmother seems to have been rather cold and strict, but Dix lived with her grandmother for many years, and actually as her grandmother got older, Dix provided care for her grandmother. So when Dorothea Dix went to live with her grandmother lived in Boston. So Dorothea Dix lived in Boston. And while she was in Boston, she became quite involved with, and actually very devoted to, the new Unitarian movement. And this was a movement that was a highly popular Christian denomination among the educated and upper class people of the Northeast, and especially around Boston at the time. So Unitarians, they were a Christian denomination. It had their origin in Puritans, who later evolved to become Congregationalists. And then there was a split between the Unitarians and the Congregationalists over the doctrine of the Trinity. So the doctrine of the Trinity would be the idea that God has three persons, which could be defined, if we're using masculine terms, in Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And the Unitarians rejected this Trinitarian doctrine. Instead, they proposed a Unitarian doctrine. And then, by the way, many years later, the Unitarians would eventually evolve to become another denomination, which is the Unitarian Universalists, which is a present-day denomination that accepts the viewpoints from multiple religions. And that today the Unitarian Universalists are probably much less popular than the Unitarians were in the mid-1800s, because in the mid-1800s, especially in the north and around Boston, there were a lot of Unitarian churches. It was a very popular denomination, especially among well-educated and upper-class people. So Dorothea Dix, she socialized with Unitarian ministers. She attended their churches. Actually, she also served as a nanny and often taught the children of Unitarian pastors and ministers. So what happened here is at one point, Dix had some kind of health problems. I'm not sure exactly what the problems were. It was around the time she was serving as a nanny for the children of Unitarian pastors, and maybe she had tuberculosis, or I'm not sure if that was the issue or not. She also seems to have been suffering from depression. So whatever her issues were, her pastor friends arranged to pay for her to take a trip to England so that she could recover from her ailments. And while she was in England, she stayed with Unitarians there. And she also would have learned about the moral therapy treatment that was being done at the Tooke's retreat in England. Given the people she stayed with, it's quite possible she may have even met Tooke or visited the York retreat. So she was in England trying to recover from her ailments. But while she was in England, her grandmother became sick. She tried to return back to the United States in time, but her grandmother actually died before she returned. But she returned back to the United States, and her grandmother had died. And as a result, Dorothea Dix inherited money from her grandmother, and she inherited quite a bit of money that allowed her to go on essentially without working and to live off the inheritance. And so what she did was she got involved in a lot of advocacy types of things. One of the things she did is that she published religious poetry. And here's an example on this page. Here's one of the poems she wrote that says, "Go clothe the naked, feed the blind, give the weary rest, for sorrow's children comfort find, and help for all distressed." So that's a poem that Dorothea Dix wrote. In addition, she got involved in teaching Sunday school in women's prisons. And while she was teaching Sunday school in prisons, she became aware of many women suffering from what today we would call mental illness, which is true today, and it was true then as well, that sometimes people with mental illness end up getting locked in prisons. And she became aware of people with mental illness that were being held in terrible conditions, and she was horrified by this. And so she began to advocate for what today we would call people with mental illness. She visited asylums, she visited prisons, and she looked at the types of conditions where people with mental illness were being held. And she found situations where people were being held in terrible conditions, and she publicized those conditions and made people aware of it. She advocated for people with mental illness. She addressed state and federal government politicians. She called for the need for us to build asylums that would provide compassionate care. It was one of the key things she advocated for, was the need to build asylums providing compassionate care for people with what today we would call mental illness. Like I said, she testified before legislatures. At one point, she even met the Queen of England. And another point, she met the Pope. And one estimate is that maybe as a result of her work, maybe in the ballpark of 40 hospitals in the United States and Europe might have been established because of her work. So Dorothea Dix was a major advocate for people with what today we would call mental illness. It was also during the decade of 1850 when there was a major breakthrough in medical understanding. Specifically in England, John Snow discovered that the disease cholera was caused by drinking sewage-contaminated water. And so Snow would have disagreed with the popular miasma theory that was widely believed at this time. Recall that miasma theory was the idea that disease was caused by breathing bad air. And Snow disagreed with that. And how he came to his conclusion was that there was actually a cholera outbreak in London. And when there was this cholera outbreak, John Snow mapped the cholera fatalities. And he drew this map, which you're looking at here on this slide, showing where there were cholera fatalities. And he realized that these fatalities tended to be centered around a particular water pump. It was actually a water pump located on Broad Street. And so he concluded that that pump was drawing water from a contaminated source. One interesting thing also about this map is that next to that water pump on Broad Street, there was actually a brewery. And that brewery had about 70 workers, but none of the workers at the brewery died. And that was because those workers were drinking mostly beer and also water from that brewery's own well. So John Snow discovered that cholera is caused by drinking sewage-contaminated water. Down at the bottom of the page, I have a picture from some years later advocating for John Snow's conclusions about the dangers of drinking contaminated drinking water. And this was a major breakthrough in the field of medicine because prior to this point, there was a solid understanding of miasma theory and bloodletting and beliefs that had maintained for thousands of years. And so John Snow's discovery here might be the first crack in that ancient medical system, that first point where that system starts to crumble and a new type of medical understanding is going to begin to emerge over time here. And now let's return to our story of Louis Agassiz. Recall that Agassiz was this naturalist from Switzerland. He had this theory of ice ages, and then Harvard invited him to come to the United States and be a professor at their brand new Lawrence Scientific School, which Louis Agassiz did. So he was a professor at the Lawrence Scientific School, and he became essentially the most famous scientist in the United States. On this page here, I have a picture of a jellyfish that's from an article that Louis Agassiz published about jellyfish in the Atlantic Ocean. And looking at that, it illustrates the fact that to publish scientific articles of this type, you had to have good artwork. I don't know who drew that picture of the jellyfish, but it certainly is a very detailed picture. So while Louis Agassiz was at that Lawrence Scientific School, he established a museum of comparative zoology. And I believe the building in this picture is a picture of that museum. And the idea is that this would be a museum where he could display specimens of different types of animals. And so people from all across the United States and actually from all around the world would send Agassiz specimens of animals because he was a famous scientist And so if someone found some kind of unusual animal, that person might say, oh, I'll capture that animal and preserve it and send it to Agassiz because he's like this famous scientist, and I'll send it to the famous scientist for his collection. So he received specimens from all over the world, which meant that essentially for his entire life, he had this problem that he was always accumulating too many specimens, and he never had enough time or space really to organize or display them like he really wanted to. So his museum tended to be more a warehouse for all the specimens he was collecting, but it didn't work out so well as a place to display them. Now, if you recall, when Agassiz came to the United States, he came without his first wife, Cecily. And shortly after Agassiz arrived in the United States, Cecily died of tuberculosis. So eventually, Agassiz marries a second time, and a second wife is Elizabeth. And Elizabeth is pictured here, along with the daughters from Agassiz's first marriage. And the thing to know about Elizabeth is that she is someone who promoted education for girls and women. In fact, she opened a school for girls. It was called the Agassiz School for Young Ladies. And so if you were a family in Boston and you had enough money to send your kids to school, you could send your daughters to the Agassiz School for Young Ladies. And part of the attraction of the school is that it was associated with the famous scientist Louis Agassiz, and he would actually sometimes even make visits to the school and talk with the students. And then later, a few decades later, in 1879, Elizabeth Agassiz becomes the first president of Radcliffe College. Now, Radcliffe College is a Harvard sister school for women, because at this time, Harvard did not award degrees to women. They only gave degrees to men. In fact, I think it was not until the 1960s before Harvard would give degrees to women. So instead of giving degrees to women, they opened up a sister college, which was a school for women, which was Radcliffe College. And Elizabeth Agassiz was president of Radcliffe College in 1879. So one thing we might note about the Agassiz family is that they are a family that favored education for women and girls. And here is a picture of Louis Agassiz giving a lecture and drawing some kind of illustration on a chalkboard. And if you might have been inclined to have some degree of positive evaluation of Louis Agassiz because his wife promoted women's education, I'm going to destroy that positive evaluation now when I talk about his views on race. So as we have seen within the academic community and in the United States especially, people strongly supported the idea of polygenesis, that racist idea that black people and white people come from different ancestors. And consistent with that current academic understanding, Louis Agassiz also strongly supported polygenesis. So he did not think that plants and animals could migrate across geographical regions. He didn't think that an animal could cross a mountain or cross an ocean. And he thought that each type of plant or animal was created by God to exist in a particular time, in a particular place. And so if you see different animals in different parts of the world, those animals don't go back to the same origin. They each have a unique and separate origin. And he thought the same was true for people, that black people and white people didn't have the same ancestors, but they have two different origins, that black people and white people, each race is derived from a different ancestor, according to his idea. And also, one of the things to note about Agassiz is that he worked pretty hard to try to reconcile his viewpoints with his understanding of the Bible. And so he opposed a traditional interpretation of Adam and Eve. So the traditional interpretation might be that Adam and Eve were the ancestors for all people. And he argued that, well, they were the ancestors for white people, but just because the Bible describes Adam and Eve doesn't mean that there might be also another set of ancestors that were the ancestors for black people. So he opposed the traditional interpretation of Adam and Eve to try to reconcile his polygenesis with the biblical story of creation. Another thing, too, is that in his attempts to demonstrate differences between black people and white people, at one point he took photographs of slaves And these actually, I believe, might be some of the earliest possible photographs we actually have of slaves, that there were ones taken by Louis Agassiz, partly because he was making an attempt to demonstrate differences between white people and black people. And as you might expect, he was very popular in the South. He was often invited to come to the South and give lectures because his ideas were very consistent with a pro-slavery idea that black people are inferior to white people. We are now at a point where we can start telling the story of where academic psychology came from. And the way the story is usually told, academic psychology is described as something coming out of Germany. But as I look at the history, I think it might be more accurate to describe academic psychology as having two sources, and especially if we're going to describe the academic psychology that eventually wound up in the United States. So I'm going to argue that academic psychology has two origins. One origin was in Germany, and the other was going to be in England. So in Germany, there is a foundation of research that we've been talking about and that we'll talk about a little bit more shortly. There is research looking at human perception. And this research led to a basic belief that perceptions are constructed in the brain. That is, perceptions are not necessarily perfect representations of stimuli, but there's a creative process where perceptions are created in the human brain. And so that resulted in people being interested in trying to understand, well, what exactly are these perceptive processes? And the goal of this research was trying to understand perceptive processes that are common to all people. And so in Germany, this line of work that leads to a question about what are the perceptive processes common to all people is going to be one foundation that will result in the academic discipline of psychology. But then in England, the key foundation here is going to be Darwin's theory. And as we'll see shortly, Darwin eventually publishes his theory. And so Darwin's theory of evolution creates a lot of interest. And from looking at Darwin's theory, people develop a belief that people may differ from each other in the extent to which they have adaptive traits. And if you believe that people differ from each other in the extent to which they have adaptive traits, that leads to this interest. In England, people became interested in wanting to measure these individual differences in adaptive traits. So whereas in Germany, people were looking at a common process in perception that's common to all people, in England, they were wanting to understand how people differed from each other in adaptive traits. And as I will show as we go along here, I think these two key foundations are essentially the foundation that led to academic psychology, and especially the academic psychology that wound up in the United States. So first, let's look at that German foundation, that line of research that led to a belief that perceptions are constructed in the brain and that perceptions are not necessarily a perfect representation of stimuli. And one key person in that line of research is Hermann von Helmholtz, depicted here. And we met Helmholtz before. He was one of Mueller's students. Recall that was that Berlin physical society that was against dualism. And I think I mentioned before that one of the things that Helmholtz did, he published an article on the speed of nerve transmission. And Helmholtz had a major interest in understanding human sensation and perception. He actually developed a theory of color vision that we know today is largely correct. He had a theory of audition, and he also invented things called resonant spheres. And I'm actually not sure exactly what they did, but here's a picture of one up on this page here. And it's something that you would put this in your ear. I think you put the little N in your ear there where it says B. You put that in your ear, and then you hear different sounds. He had spheres of different sizes, and you put that in your ear and you hear different sounds, kind of like when you're listening to the sound of the ocean and a seashell type of sound. And so in looking at perception in all of his studies, looking at audition and resonance spheres and color vision, one of his key conclusions was that unconscious processes are involved in perception. That it's not exactly a one-to-one process of we have a stimulus and then that stimulus is perceived, but rather there's a stimulus and that triggers activity in the brain, and the activity in the brain is an unconscious process, and that perception is based on that unconscious process occurring in the brain. And again, that's going to be one of the key foundations of this German tradition. Another person that's important for this German foundation, leading to the belief that perceptions are constructed in the brain, and this foundation of research that led to psychology. So another person that's important for this is Gustav Fechner. And Fechner continued the line of research on the German psychophysics. So if you recall, previously I talked about Weber. He was the person that started this research on German psychophysics. And Weber was the one who was interested in understanding sensation and how much does a stimulus have to change before people are capable of detecting that change. And if you recall, Weber had a formula for describing that phenomena, a formula for describing how much a stimulus had to change before people could detect it. So Fechner did further work with Weber's formula, and he decided that that his formula wasn't quite correct. And Fechner came up with a different formula, a different mathematical equation to describe sensation. And his formula is here, SK log R, where S is a level of sensation, R is a level of the stimulus, and K is a constant. It's a constant times the log of R, the stimulus value, is equal your sensation of that stimulus. And again, the formula here isn't so much important as the fact that on one hand, he had a mathematical formula to describe sensation. And even more importantly here, his formula has a log transformation as part of his formula. So it's not a direct linear relationship between a stimulus and sensation. There's a log transformation here that makes it a curvilinear relationship. It's not a straight linear relationship. There's a curve in there in the formula. And that raises a big question. Where does the curve come from? If it's not direct one-to-one, if there's not a direct one-to-one relationship between a stimulus and your sensation of it, where does that curve come in? And again, that leads to the idea, well, it must be constructed in your brain. Your brain must be involved in the process of creating human perceptions. So Fechner is another part of this foundation of this German tradition that will be a foundation for academic psychology. And now let's look at the English foundation that would lead to academic psychology. And as I mentioned, that foundation is built on the ideas of Darwin. And in 1859, finally, he publishes his book on the origin of species, where he outlines his theory of natural selection, or his theory of evolution. His work, to some degree, is based on ideas or influenced by ideas from Malthus, Thomas Malthus, who wrote about how population growth can be faster than is supported by the food supply. If people or animals reproduced at the rate at which they could reproduce, they would reproduce more offspring than there is food to feed those offspring. And to some degree, Darwin's theory addresses this issue. So the idea that Darwin proposed is that there's natural variation in animals. Some traits are more adaptive than others. He proposed that animals pass their traits on to their offspring, and those with more adaptive traits are more likely to survive, mate, and pass their traits on to their offspring. Consequently, there is a natural selection of animals with adaptive traits, and species can evolve and change over time. So that's Darwin's basic theory. Now, one thing that people often wonder about is, why did he wait so long before he published his theory? Why was there this delay? Because he figured out his theory of natural selection. He arrived at that theory almost 20 years prior to this point. So why did he wait 20 years before he published his theory? One idea, maybe he was just worried about the controversy it would cause. Notably, his wife was Christian and very religious, and he might have been worried about upsetting her, or maybe she would be upset by the controversy. Or maybe he was just trying to be super careful and cautious and make sure he'd worked out everything really well before he published it. Another thing to note, and this might be related to why he waited, maybe not, but Darwin seems to have been plagued by frequent illness. He had problems with gas and flatulence, with nausea, stomach problems, different types of gastrointestinal problems. And so he often didn't feel well. And actually, he often avoided visitors because he wasn't feeling well. I'm not sure why this is. Some people speculate that when he was in South America, he might have caught a disease called Changa's disease from beetles in that area, and that might be what caused his illness. I'm not sure what it was. Here I have a picture of Darwin and his son from 1842. And knowing that Darwin was plagued by illness throughout most of his life, whenever I see pictures of him, I always end up looking at the picture and thinking, boy, he doesn't look like he's feeling very well in that picture. So 1859, Darwin publishes his book on the origin of species. Now, whatever the reason was that Darwin delayed so long before he published his book, the person that might be most responsible for prompting Darwin to eventually publish could be this person depicted here, Alfred Russel Wallace. So Wallace was a naturalist, like Darwin, and also like Louis Agassiz, and he was studying animals in the archipelago islands of Indonesia, depicted in that map there. And Wallace came to a conclusion very similar to Darwin's theory. Initially, he was unaware of Darwin's theory, and he put his ideas down in a paper and submitted it to review. And it turned out that Darwin got the paper to review the paper, and he realized, oh, this person's proposing the same theory that I came up with 20 years ago. Darwin was trying to figure out what to do about that, and what they decided was that Darwin and Wallace together would present a joint paper in 1858 at a conference. Now, as it turned out, for some reason, that initial paper didn't get much reaction. In fact, the president of the Linnean Society, that's the place where they presented the paper, he concluded that, well, there had not been any striking discoveries in the year 1858. So that initial paper didn't get a big response. But then the next year, 1859, when Darwin publishes his book, that book, of course, gets a really big response, a very strong reaction to that book, and people get very excited about Darwin's theory of natural selection. And here are some more pictures of Darwin. Again, he never seems like he's looking all that happy in these pictures. So let's consider this. What were Darwin's ideas on race? To some extent, they're not entirely clear, but he did seem to follow the conventions for white males of the time of viewing white men as being superior to others. So, for example, in his writing, he used phrases like he used the phrase, talked about savage races of man. He called people in South Africa the lowest savages. He talked about the idea that there would be civilized races at some point might overtake the lower races. So he certainly used language that implied inequality between people, and inequality between black people and white people, or inequality between people that might fit different race categories. Notably, he also followed the conventional white male view of the time in suggesting that men had evolved to be more intelligent than women. Notably, on the other hand, Darwin was against slavery, although as we've seen, a lot of times abolitionists can still be very racist in their viewpoints. Also note, one issue about Darwin's ideas is that eventually Darwin's theory would lead to a concept of social Darwinism, the idea that different people groups might evolve, just like individuals can evolve or a species would evolve, that groups can evolve so that one group might be superior to another group. So, for example, the idea that maybe white people evolved to be superior to black people. And that would be the idea of social Darwinism. And that idea is something that, on the one hand, Darwin never actively supported social Darwinism. On the other hand, he never really spoke out against it. And so in some ways, he kind of left the door open to it. And as we'll see, Darwin's theory is going to be used to support a lot of racist ideas. And Darwin didn't really do anything that stopped his theory from being used in that way.
That says when the shadows fall and light shines out a call for compassion and sorrow. Maybe we can be the people with hope for tomorrow. 'Cause when the shadows fall and light shines out a call for compassion and sorrow. Maybe we can be the people with hope for tomorrow.
And now, after talking about the German Foundation and the English Foundation for Psychology, I am ready to present to you the very first academic psychologist. So by tradition, the very first academic psychologist is the person on the right, Wilhelm Wundt. So Wilhelm Wundt in Germany is traditionally considered the very first academic psychologist. Now, the way I'm going to tell the story, there's a parallel development of psychology in England, and the first psychologist there will be Francis Galton. And if we look at how psychology developed in the United States, it seems to me it's really a combination of Wilhelm Wundt's psychology from Germany and Francis Galton's psychology from England. In some ways, Wundt's psychology is the more official, that's the official source of psychology. But I think if you look at psychology in the United States, we're going to find that Francis Galton actually probably had a larger influence on what psychology became than Wilhelm Wundt. So here we have two people that could be called first psychologists. And I like this picture here because they're both about the same age. They're both striking about the same pose, kind of leaning on something with their elbows, both dressed in their suits. So here's a nice picture to compare Francis Galton on the left and Wilhelm Wundt on the right. Francis Galton, the beginning of the English tradition of psychology. Wilhelm Wundt, the person that started the German tradition of psychology. Now, I might have been jumping ahead of myself just a bit, because in the decade of 1850, neither Wilhelm Wundt nor Francis Galton were yet doing any psychology. So what were they doing in the decade of 1850? Let's start with Francis Galton. And to give you some background, Galton was actually a cousin to Charles Darwin. And Galton is going to be yet one more white male from a wealthy family. Galton inherited money from his father. He became independently wealthy, and he never had to work for a living. Interestingly, there's kind of mixed reports about Galton's early academic experience and his academic skills as he was growing up. One report is that he was kind of a child prodigy and had amazing academic skills. But then another report is that as a college student, he was only mediocre. So I'm not exactly sure what his early academic skills were. Either way, his first endeavor that he explored as a young adult was he went on an expedition in Africa. He went on a trip trying to explore the source of the Nile. And then when he came back from that trip, he published a book, and this would be what happened in the decade of 1850. Well, in 1855, he published a book about his journey, his expedition in Africa, and the name of his book was Art of Travel. So in 1855, Galton published Art of Travel, and it described his experiences. It had little tips for exploration in there, things like, I think one of his tips was, if you want to find honey and you can find a honeybee and get a hair and lasso the honeybee with a hair and hold the hair, the honeybee will then lead you to the hive, and then you can use that to get the honey. So that was types of things he published in Art of Travel. And I think that book sold well and made him somewhat famous. Notably, in talking about Galton, this is also a good point to consider how history deals with racism and how when people write about history in textbooks and tell the history of psychology, how well people deal with the issue of racism. Because I'm aware of textbooks that describe Galton, one textbook in particular that talks about art of travel, and it compliments Galton for having egalitarian views of black and white people. The book I can recall talks about how Galton viewed Africans as being equals and how Galton didn't view Africans as being subhuman, which was a common viewpoint at the time. But to describe Galton that way glosses over the fact that in many other of his writings, he describes black people as intellectually inferior to white people. He clearly did not view black people and white people as equal. He clearly had racist ideas. In fact, as we'll see later, Galton would go on to propose many extremely racist ideas in a program that he called eugenics. And we will be looking at that later on. But I think that's an interesting example of how, on one hand, a textbook might write about Galton and describe Galton as having egalitarian views between black people and white people, when if you look closely at what he wrote, he clearly did not maintain those views. Galton was clearly racist in his viewpoints. And so what about Wilhelm Wundt? What is his background and story? So Wundt came from a prominent family, but they were not extremely wealthy, not as wealthy as Galton's family by any means. Wundt's father was a Lutheran pastor. And it seems that growing up, Wundt may have had somewhat of a lonely childhood. Reports are that he had very few friends, and he didn't really appear to be very close to his father. As a boy, there's one story that Wundt was receiving instruction from one of his father's assistants, and then that assistant moved away, and Wundt was very sad and distressed that the assistant moved away, and then Wundt was allowed to go and spend a year living with that assistant to try to make Wundt happier. Then when Wundt was 13, his father died, and then later it was time for Wundt to go to gymnasium. So gymnasium would be what today we might call high school, or the German equivalent of high school. And so first he went to a Catholic gymnasium, and he appears to have not liked that school. He described that school as my school of suffering. And he says that while he was there, he engaged in unbridled daydreaming. Some stories are of him being slapped by teachers there and not getting along with classmates. Maybe even once he tried to run away. So he didn't like that Catholic gymnasium. But then he went to a Lutheran gymnasium after that, and he graduated and was successful there. So then, after graduating from gymnasium, Wundt begins medical studies at the University of Heidelberg. And he studies with Robert Bunsen. And I believe this is the same Bunsen that the Bunsen burner is named after. Although, as indicated by this cartoon down here, Bunsen made other important contributions to chemistry, but what we remember him for is developing the Bunsen burner. A note on the right-hand side of our screen here, I have a picture that has Bunsen on the left, and on the right, that's Helmholtz. Recall, we were just talking about Helmholtz. He was one of those foundational researchers doing research that laid the foundation for the German tradition of psychology. He was doing research on sensation and perception and had the belief that perceptions are created in the brain. And so Helmholtz is going to be important. In just a moment here, we're going to talk about Helmholtz. But before we do that, let's go back. So Wundt is doing studies with Bunsen. He's actually doing research on salt and urine. I think he's doing this research on himself, and he does a study, and he actually publishes it, and it gets cited well. So this is kind of the first major academic success for Wundt, where he does research on salt and urine, publishes it, and it gets well cited. Then, after he graduates, he's looking for work, and where is Wundt going to find work? Well, Wundt finds work here. In 1858, Wundt becomes a teaching assistant for none other than Helmholtz. Wundt becomes Helmholtz's teaching assistant, and he remains in that position for 7 years, for quite a while. And here I have that picture is a picture of Helmholtz. That's not Wundt, that's Helmholtz in the picture. And then on the right, I have Wundt's device for testing visual acuity. And I put that picture there to remind us of two important things about the type of work that Wundt was doing when he was Helmholtz's teaching assistant. First, note, this is a device for testing visual acuity. That is, it's a device for testing an aspect of human sensation and perception. And that's one key characteristic of their work. They were doing work trying to understand aspects of human sensation and perception. And as I've mentioned, one of the key themes in their work involves Helmholtz's belief that perceptions are created in the brain. Now, another thing to note about that contraption is this. Simply, it's a contraption. I don't know exactly how it works, but it's some kind of a mechanism that's designed to measure some aspect of human sensation and perception. And this will be a theme we'll see later on when Wundt goes on to develop psychology. He'll focus on all kinds of contraptions and ways of measuring different aspects of human perception.